Welcome back to the School of Muscle podcast. Today I have on what I believe is my first repeat guest for my podcast here. And it is for good reasons here. So if you haven't seen him on video already, this is Max Coleman joining me today again. And I had him on about a month ago to discuss some studies that he did on drop sets and some research there. But he actually just had a recent study published here or pre-published, and that is over deloads and whether those are effective or not. And I know that this is something that is debated between people that kind of hate deloads and people that use them often. I tend to be in the camp that uses them often, but maybe I won't so much anymore after this podcast. We'll have to wait and see. So with that kind of setup here, Max, and to give the people listening the title of your study here, it's called Gaining More from Doing Less, the effects of a 1-week deload period during supervised resistance training on muscular adaptations. So that is the study here. But actually allow Max to talk here. For this study, could you kind of give us a little bit of a setup here on why you wanted to do it? And maybe if we kind of just talk a little bit as well about the theory on why deloads might be beneficial when it comes to resistance adaptations and kind of start there.
Yeah, for sure. Well done. Great intro there. And this is the second time now that I've heard someone else say the title of the study, and this is now the second time that I'm realizing I should have truncated that big time because it's certainly quite a mouthful. But yeah, so deloads are obviously like really popular within like the evidence-based zeitgeist right now, with a bunch of people talking about the vast benefits that you get from them, right? And there's a lot of really good rationale as to like why deloads are a really good idea. And actually, you know what, let me backtrack a little bit and answer the second question first, which is kind of like what deloads are and kind of the rationale for them. So deloads don't have a super set definition in the literature or even amongst just lifters in general right now. And there are some researchers working towards that actually right now. We just, I along with Dr. Pack and then some other individuals out of England, just worked on a paper where we're trying to like create an actual definition for deloads because right now there just isn't one. So what we kind of are working with right now is just that deloads, generally speaking, are a short period, about 1 week of reduced training volume or intensity, used with the intent of kind of like dissipating the fatigue you get from resistance training, while maintaining any fitness care like benefits that you got, in hopes to kind of like potentiate better growth or results in future training, right? And so obviously they're really popular just in conversation as well as in practice in evidence-based individuals. And there's a lot of good rationales for why they exist. So like, as we know, like when we start lifting weights and when we start exercising, we get all these incredible benefits, right? Our muscles start growing, we get stronger, our dads finally tell us that they're proud of us. But we also get these like negative things too, right? So obviously everyone knows about the fitness fatigue model that was proposed like originally in the 80s, which just says that exercising is great, gives us good things, but it gives us bad things as well, right? So that led to a lot of people thinking that these short periods away from training, right, deloads, can allow for that dissipation of fatigue while maintaining all the fitness stuff, right? And there's actually some data on this, not a lot of direct data looking at deloads, but a lot of data looking at like detraining. And we've seen some mechanistic rationales for why they're a good idea. So we've seen that individuals after periods of detraining sometimes see more favorable testosterone to cortisol ratios, kind of a shift to more growth-prone fibers, muscle fibers following periods of detraining, faster rates of strength gain and muscle growth and whatnot. And that's great, but a lot of those are acute studies that don't look at the like long-term potentiating effects of deloads, right? And we do have some data on this. So there's 2 studies out of Japan by Ogasawara et al. And they're really good studies looking at the like long-term potentiating effects of detraining, but they're not perfect like most studies or all studies, right? So they used untrained subjects. They only used the bench press throughout the course of the study. And kind of most stark of which is that they used 3-week detraining periods, which are just a lot longer than what is typically used by lifters, right? Most often it's usually like 5 to 7 days is what the typical deload length looks like, right? So yeah, the goal of our study, or the goal of this study, was to assess the effects of deloading or detraining on muscular adaptations like strength and hypertrophy, but using more kind of real world, fancy word, ecologically valid paradigms for deloading. So kind of long winded there. If you want me to break that down, I'm happy to do so.
No, I think that was great. I think that you definitely covered the physiological rationale for why deloads make sense, or theoretically make sense at least. And then also, I like that you covered that there is a little bit of research on there regarding kind of, I would call them like deload patterns, but not much regarding like the more practical way that people tend to implement deloads in their resistance training programs. So usually you see some sort of paradigm of accumulating volume for a certain period of time, usually 4 to 8 weeks, and then taking a single week of reduced load, reduced volume, or something along that line. So it sounds like with this study here, you guys are attempting to kind of mimic that actual practical behavior a little bit more than some of the other research that might do like a 3-week deload period or something a bit different than what we would typically see. So I think kind of with that set up there, let's now kind of turn into, what did you guys actually decide to do here? What were your methods? How did you decide to kind of set this up so you did kind of shoot to test a more kind of, as you mentioned, ecologically valid way of what people are doing kind of in practice here?
Yeah, so I mean, just like those Ogasawara studies, our study certainly was not perfect in terms of ecological validity. Like it doesn't look exactly like the way that most people probably deload in the real world. Like, so for instance, we used detraining instead of like a normal deload paradigm where you like reduce the training volume intensity. But anyway, I'll start from the start of how we went about this, right? So we took 39 individuals, both men and women, with about 4 years of training experience on average, and that ranged from like 15 and some to as little as 1 year and some. And we started with 50 subjects, but you always start with more subjects than you need, just because with studies like this, study designs like this, you always account for dropouts because we are essentially torturing these people twice a week for 9 weeks, right? So anyway, took those 39 individuals and placed them into one of two groups, either a deload group who trained for 4 weeks straight, took 1 week completely away from training and then trained for another 4 weeks, or a traditional group that just trained for the entire 9-week period nonstop, right? Both groups trained twice weekly with us with the lower body. And those workouts consisted of 5 sets in the 8 to 12 rep range of the Smith machine squat, the leg extension, the seated calf raise, and the leg press calf raise. And all sets were taken to volitional failure, and each subject got 2 minutes rest between each set, right? And then they also did an upper body program as well. It was 2 days as well. And those weren't supervised, but they logged their workouts and sent them to either myself or Ryan Burke, who you've also had on this podcast. Shout out Ryan Burke, just to make sure that they were like adhering to the upper body program, right? And for those of you that like numbers, that equated to about 90 total weekly sets for the entire body, 20 for the quads, 20 for the calves, and then 50 for the remaining upper body musculature, right? So we measured hypertrophy, obviously, so muscle thickness of the quads and the calves, as well as some performance measures, right? So things like 1RM Smith machine squat, some isometric strength of the quads, leg extension endurance, and then vertical jump test as well. And then finally, we also measured feelings regarding participants' perceptions of fatigue. So we used this thing called the Readiness to Train questionnaire. But we didn't do so pre and post like most other measures in the study. We did so right after that 4th week and right after that 9th week of training. So kind of similar to how coaches would do like weekly check-ins. You talk to your client, in this case, a subject, asking them how they felt. The questionnaire consists of questions like, how physically strong do you feel today? How mentally strong? What was your sleep quality like? So typical normal check-in, like seeing how people feel regarding like the levels of fatigue and stuff like that, right? So those are the things that we took, and those with the resistance training protocols. We can delve a little bit more deeply into either the measurements or the protocols themselves. But I just threw a lot at you, so I'll take a beat.
Yeah, let's just kind of review their training program and stuff here. So to me, it sounds like and breaking this down into maybe sets per muscle. So it sounds like for their legs, or maybe even for their quads specifically, they were doing about 10 sets per session for 2 sessions per week, right? So about 20 weekly kind of hard sets to all out failure. And then they're also doing an upper body workout, and all of this together came to be about 90 sets for their entire body throughout the week. So my understanding is definitely not like just a super easy program that someone could do and wouldn't need to deload from. Like, I think that this program has sufficient volume in it in which it might, at least in theory, necessitate some sort of deload, considering like doing 20 sets for your quads per week. That's a non-trivial amount of volume. So does it sound like I'm kind of understanding the training aspect portion of this?
Yeah, absolutely. So actually, it's funny you say that. Thank you, because I don't think I've talked about this anywhere else. So I appreciate you doing that. We originally started with 4 sets, so it was going to be like 16 weekly sets for the quads and for the calves, and we were going to give like an optional upper body program for them to follow. But through conversations with Dr. Schoenfeld and others, we kind of decided that we probably want to really push them. So, given that this is kind of like a proof of concept study, given it's the first deload study, we really wanted to kind of push that volume and make sure that quote unquote they earn that their deload, right? Because that's typically what is done in the real world, right? You build up to like kind of these insane levels of volume so that you can then hopefully get some sort of super compensatory effect from overreaching and then deloading, right? So that was kind of the goal. Yeah, exactly. Just make it so that if there is any need for a like make sure that if there is a deload happening, that they needed it because of the amount of volume that we were throwing at them. And 90 weekly sets is certainly nothing like crazy. It's not anything that you would be like, oh my God, how did they survive that? But yeah, 20 sets for the quads to all out failure weekly is certainly something that at least I would want to deload from after 4 weeks. I can assure you that.
Yeah, absolutely. And as you said, 90 sets, it isn't crazy. I would say a lot of my clients, they end up averaging somewhere around about 100 weekly sets kind of throughout their entire mesocycle, maybe starting a little bit lower and kind of working up to a higher number than that. But I think that in this study, volume to me anyways seems sufficient to where towards the end of especially like a 9-week block, might expect them to be kind of wanting to have a reduced load period there. And to kind of continue on the methods a little bit just to make sure I have these sorted. So for your participants, I believe reading this study, I believe 39 participants made it kind of all the way through. And then these participants were both men and women, and they had training experience. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely. So we had mostly men. I believe it was, I think it was like around 80% male, 20% female or something like that. And yeah, an average training experience. So in order to be a part of the study, you had to have at least 1 year of consistent lower body resistance training. But on average, throughout like all of the subjects, it was about 4 years of training experience. Like I said, some had more experience than me, which is really rare to run into as far as like research assistants or research participants is concerned. So we had some with like 15 years of experience and then some with only just over a year, for instance. But it averaged out to be about 4 years of training experience, which is to say intermediate kind of beginner-ish intermediate levels of training, I would say.
Yep, perfect. And then both groups, it was a 9-week block. One group trained all the way through the 9 weeks, and the deload group, they took a deload after the 4-week mark. And for their deload specifically, what did that kind of look like? Was it, conventional deloads might be chopping volume in half, or maybe even not training that deload week? What did your guys' kind of deload look like here?
Yeah, so it was complete detraining. So they were allowed to like play sports or like if they wanted to go for a run or a bike ride. I don't know. Some people like doing that. I can't imagine, but they were allowed to do stuff like that. They just weren't allowed to do any resistance training whatsoever throughout the course of that week. So from the time that they came in for their last session of week 4 until their first session of, week 6, I guess technically, absolutely no lifting weights whatsoever. So it was a detraining more so than it was a deload. And that's a limitation that I'm sure we'll touch on later as well.
Right. And I would say that practically speaking, there are a lot of my clients in which in their deload week, sometimes it's even better to just not train at all because they can't like actually hold themselves back for a deload week specifically, but we can maybe touch on some of those practical implications here in a little bit. So
For sure.
I think with that sets up kind of what you guys did well, gives some background on why you guys wanted to do this study. So now kind of time to get to what I think is the good stuff here to actually dive into the results here. So what did you guys find? Are deloads just as big, crackpot a waste of time, or like how did people get on when they took a deload compared to not?
Yeah, so I'll wait to talk about like the discussion of the findings until after we actually talk about the findings, but and then my insights onto if this is pointless or not, right? But our findings are, for the most part, like not that crazy or not that stark, right? So both groups saw substantial increases in muscle size over the course of the study, but neither group really saw a substantial difference over the other, right? So as far as muscle size is concerned, at least taking 1 week off certainly didn't attenuate any of the growth that those individuals saw in the first 4 weeks, right? And the same can be said regarding like a lot of like performance things. So like muscle endurance and muscle power, for instance, both groups increased their like power and endurance, but neither one really outperformed the other by any means. Things get really interesting though when we start talking about strength. That's where we started noticing some differences. So both groups definitely got stronger. However, those in the traditional group actually got substantially stronger than those in the deload group, right? And this was true for both 1RM strength and isometric quad strength. But it was more stark in the isometric findings than in the 1RM findings. And I have some theories as to why that might be the case that we can delve into, but we can do that later if you'd like. We also found some really interesting things regarding that RTTQ, that readiness to train questionnaire that I was talking about. So the traditional group actually showed slight benefits to those in the deload group here as well. So for instance, the deload group actually saw an uptick in the amount of muscle soreness that they experienced from week 4 to week 9, whereas the traditional group actually saw a decrease. So they were more sore after week 4 than they were after week 9, which makes a lot of sense, obviously. But motivation to train was also something that was affected. So those in the deload group actually saw a decrease in their motivation to exercise after week 9. So they had a higher motivation to train after week 4 than after week 9, whereas the traditional group, they saw no differences whatsoever. So they were, at least on the average, consistently motivated to train throughout the study, which kind of throws a huge wrench in the whole, like the idea behind, there's a huge push for deloads is like the psychological benefit that you get from deloads, but seemingly, and it's just one study and it's just one measure on the readiness to train questionnaire. But that was like one of the most interesting things to me was that it kind of gave us the opposite of what we were expecting. So yeah, just threw a lot at you again, but to sum it up, no real difference with hypertrophy, endurance, or power. But those that trained continuously did see slight benefits over the deload group as far as like strength, as well as some of their perceptions of the fatigue that they were experiencing throughout the study.
Perfect. Well, I think now is a good time to kind of maybe pull apart each kind of individual result there just a little bit more. So when it comes to kind of muscle growth, so it sounds like between both groups, not kind of much of a difference there to where, for me, I would say that I would kind of expect that to some degree regarding like 9-week study, just having 1 week of reduced or no training probably isn't going to make a measurable difference in hypertrophy. Now, over the course of an entire macro cycle, several of these blocks, maybe you start to see them better manage fatigue there and start to outrun the group not deloading. What do you kind of think there? Why do you think maybe we're not seeing differences regarding hypertrophy there?
So yeah, I think the biggest thing, obviously, is just the grossness of the measures that we're taking. When I say grossness, I don't mean like icky. I just mean like
Yeah.
rude to a certain extent and large. So we did ultrasound, right? And there is how much muscle can you really build in 9 weeks? It's like obviously not that crazy. So trying to tease out differences between someone who did 2 extra workouts on top of another person, the magnitude of difference there is going to be too small for an ultrasound to pick up, most likely, right? With that said, if we pushed it, I think that, so I haven't had a chance to talk about this on anywhere else, so I'd love to talk about it now. I think that one of the most common mistakes that I see people interpreting in people's interpretation of research is that they just say, and I promise you, I'm not saying that you're saying this at all, because you did it, but they just say, oh, if the study went on longer, they would have found X. And whatever that they would have found is just whatever their belief is already, right? So if you don't like deloads, you're probably like, yeah, if the study had been for 24 weeks, they probably would have just still seen no differences, whatever, right? And if you do love deloads, you're probably like, yeah, if they had done the study for 24 weeks, I'm sure the deload group would have done a lot better, right? Unfortunately, I can't give you an answer there because we don't have this study repeated for 24 weeks. That being said, there are studies, those 2 studies by Ogasawara, those did last, one of which lasted 6 months, right? And they still didn't see much difference between the 2 groups, though the one that trained continuously in that study did see slight benefits. They just didn't reach statistical significance, right? So yeah, sorry, super long-winded and went on a tangent there, but if the study went on for longer, I can't really say for certain if one group would have, like, if as far as hypertrophy is concerned, one group would have ended up teasing out the other one. My biases, if you're curious, I personally think that the deload group probably would have seen superior growth. That's solely based on the fact that if I were doing that program, I think all of the like tendons and ligaments in my body would have torn apart, so I wouldn't be able to continue growing muscle. But I'm just not super sure as far as the averages are concerned.
Yeah, and I think definitely good points there. And I think a more accurate depiction of what I should have said is, instead of maybe it would have seen better results, more like the probability of them seeing a little bit better results might have been a bit better in the time course of a macro cycle, or even throughout a training career, to have these periods of kind of reduced training. Although the kind of counter argument to that, and to kind of put my biases forward, I don't deload with all my clients very regularly. Some clients I do, some clients I don't. And with myself personally, I actually don't deload that often, more so like every 3 or 4 months. So I take different approaches there, but kind of coming back around there, I would say that the argument for not deloading is just more total time throughout your entire year training, to where if you're deloading every 4th or 5th week, then that might be a month, almost 2 months out of your training year to where you're just deloading. But then the argument from that is, you can still be adapting and recovering and growing during your deload. So is it really time not growing? So there's a bunch of kind of considerations there. But beyond this study, this is what this study looked at. It wasn't this macro cycle study. That study would be hell to conduct. So
yeah, I can't even imagine. I mean, if I can piggyback off of that, right? I think so. I've caught some slack on social media because we're comparing a group that trained for 4 weeks we're comparing a group that trained for 8 weeks to a group that trained for 9 weeks. And a lot of people are saying, like, how can you, that's not fair. But I think it lends itself really well to what you just said, which is that if you're given a 9-week period as a person, and we say you have this much time to put on as much muscle or strength as possible, that's what it looks like. You would take a deload in the middle. You wouldn't just give yourself an extra week afterwards to increase that time frame, right? So I think it lends itself well to what you just said in ecological validity, for sure.
Yep, I absolutely agree. And to zoom that out to a macro cycle even more, then you would say that, if someone didn't deload for a year and you wanted to compare it to someone that did deload, well, to compare it to someone that did deload, you'd have to make them train for like a year and a half for that to
Exactly.
That's just not, practically speaking, that's not what people want. They want, in this time frame, are my results going to better or worse if I deload or not? So I think those people give you slack better idiots too. So yeah, so that covers, I think, hypertrophy pretty well there. It's like, in this 9 weeks, didn't see really benefits, but also I think an important thing is you also didn't see worse results from deloading, to where the group that deloaded still similar hypertrophy. So one could see that 2 ways. Either someone might interpret that as you should just train all the way through because you're going to get just as good as hypertrophy. A different person whose bias might be towards deloading might be, you should take deloads because with less work, you're going to get a similar result over 9 weeks.
I think that a lot of times individuals want research to tell them exactly what to do. I know that when I was first getting into like the evidence-based side, I really wanted research. I wanted to see a study and then have it tell me like exactly what I should or should not be doing in the gym. And I think that lends itself kind of well to, like, we want studies to have a difference between groups, because then it gives us insights into what we should be avoiding or what we shouldn't be avoiding, right? Whereas what research really does, which is just gives us kind of a roadmap, a kind of a blueprint for how we should build our programs. And that's kind of good. Looking at research like that makes it good when you have research that doesn't give you direct findings, right? Because now, as coaches, Ryan, you and I, or just as lifters, we can be like, oh, cool. So like, I don't have to worry about going on vacation with my family once every 6 months or something like that. Or conversely, you can be like, oh, I love to train all the time. So now I don't have to take a deload because it's not going to make me any more jacked than, you know what I mean? So like, I think that's beneficial. Now, I one caveat to that is I hope no one takes the findings from this study and says, oh, cool, I never have to deload again, because that's certainly not the case, right? In fact, that was what I was most worried about, was our findings showing the traditional group does better, because then it's just going to be like Armageddon of people being like, you idiots, why would I ever take time away from the gym more, which is not at all what I want people to take away.
And I've already seen a little bit of that to where people that I would say I even respect highly in the evidence-based community taking this study and saying, hey, this is evidence that you don't need to deload. And I'm like, I don't think that's what this was evidence for. It did not look at an entire like career of lifting and compare that to deloading versus not. And I would generally say that I would lean towards having some sort of fatigue management within your program, regardless of whether that looks like a deload or some light days or something like that. But I think that does cover kind of the hypertrophy aspect of this. So to pull apart some of those other results here. So for strength, you saw a little bit better strength with a group that trained all the way through, correct?
Absolutely.
Gotcha. And were there any reasons that you thought that that might have kind of been the case, or any kind of speculation on why they might have saw a little bit better results there when it comes to strength?
So I don't have like a lot of great like mechanistic reasons why this might be the case. So obviously there's the, like, you may have lost some of that like neural, some of that like motor pattern. It may have deteriorated while you were taking a period away. So you had to like relearn the movement, and that kind of inhibited any strength gains you may have gotten upon return to the gym. Also, we kind of hypothesized that individuals would do better having taken the deload because they would come back feeling like refreshed and ready to go. However, if you read the paper, you probably saw that individuals didn't really feel refreshed upon returning to the gym. They kind of felt lethargic and slow. And coming back to the gym, because we didn't do what a lot of people do in the real world, which is take a deload, then you come back with like lower volumes and build your way back up, right? We had a high volume program, deload, high volume program, right back to it. So that might have posed some issues as well. And then one of the things I noted, I said I had some theories as to why there were differences in the strength tests that we did. So those in the traditional group got stronger across both tests, but it was just much more apparent in the isometric data than the 1RM Smith squat data or tests. And I think that's largely because of the specificity of the test. So we did a 1 rep max Smith squat, right? But we also trained with Smith squats throughout the course of the study. So they were getting a lot of practice in that movement. Even those that took a week off were getting a lot of practice in that movement. So that kind of masked maybe the detriments of taking a week off, but they weren't able to practice the isometric strength like test at all, because no one has access to a $60,000 Biodex dynamometer in their house, right? So I think that just gives insights, especially the fact that both corroborate with one another, and the one with less specificity showed more of a detriment, kind of suggests that maybe there is maybe there are some negatives associated with taking a week completely away from training. So that's kind of, that was what I was alluding to earlier with my theories as to why there were differences and discrepancies.
Yep. And I would say that aligns well with kind of my practical experience with clients, to where, and it depends a bit on client to client, to where some deload and they come back and it's like the first week they're just like shaking the rust off, getting back into things, and they feel a little bit off, to where others don't seem to notice that as much. And I also think that maybe there's something to do with a neurological component of just not lifting any weights whatsoever for that week, to where it takes them a second to get back into things. And then also, like you said, they just didn't have a week there to continue practicing the Smith squats to maintain their skill on that, which strength has more components to it than just how big the muscle is. You have the neurological components as well as the skill components as well. So I think that's where I would kind of place my bets on what was kind of going on with that one. But to maybe transition to what I thought was kind of one of the more interesting findings of this as well, which was the kind of motivation to train and the kind of feeling like the groups needed a deload. And if I'm correct, the group that trained all the way through, at the end of the study, they still like kind of felt fine and felt ready to kind of keep training. And we also saw some interesting things with kind of motivation to train. So could we maybe kind of cover those again, and maybe also cover why you think these individuals kind of experienced what they did when it came to kind of motivation to train and different things like that?
So we did see like that, like we said, that decrease in motivation to train in those that took a deload, and no difference for those in the traditional group. The reasons for that, I have no clue. I mean, personally, if I take a week away from the gym, like that's kind of my impetus for doing a deload. Like, and that's how I can tell when I'm like ready to go again, is when I'm like dying to get back to the gym after a deload, right? So that as at least me personally, I can't imagine. Now, other individuals who aren't as obsessed and weird as I am with training and stuff, maybe taking a week off, they're like, oh, this was really nice. I didn't have to go get yelled at by Max and all of his research assistants, so I don't want to do that anymore. So that's obviously one reason or one possibility as to why that was the case. But I mean, I can't provide insights into why they saw this decrease in motivation. Obviously, the increase in muscle soreness makes sense. They took a week completely away from training, whereas those in the traditional group kept reaping the benefits of the repeated bout effect, right? So that's one theory. But I personally, it kind of is the exact opposite of what you and I and probably most people thought they would see with regard to motivation.
And in regards to that measurement there, and I must miss this in our kind of method section, but were they asked about their motivation on a weekly basis and then they saw the dip kind of in those middle weeks? Or when was the timing of when they were asked about their motivation to train there?
Yeah, so it was 24 hours after the last workout of week 4 and 24 hours after the last workout of week 9. So it was when we would like be implementing a deload in theory, right? Like every 4 weeks is when we did the readiness to train questionnaire. And I forgot to touch on this a second ago, but yeah, what you had touched on, that we did talk to the participants at the end of each study, or at the end of each of their studies. So not everyone finished at the same time. And we asked them, like, how do you feel? Like, do you think you're going to take a deload after this, or are you going to get right back to training? And every single subject, except for maybe one or two, said that they were going to get back to training within a couple of days. So even though we tried throwing all the volume in the world that we could at them and intensity, it seemingly wasn't enough for the students at Lehman College. So shout out to you warriors out there. But so that's one reason also that the deload may have been done a detriment, is because the subjects may not have felt that they needed one in the first place.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. I would say with a lot of my clients, once they get towards the end of the mesocycle, usually motivation to train is actually pretty low and that sort of thing. But that's usually a result of them kind of feeling like they need to deload. So like I could have seen, like, if you asked them, after that 4-week block, if they were super overreached, then at that point, yeah, I would expect maybe their motivation to train is down. But the fact that the other group just like went through it all fine and like got to the end of the day, it was like, hey, we're still fine. That was definitely surprising, and it's hard to say why that is. I would say there's a chance there's some sort of potential psychological component of knowing that you're going into a week of no training is kind of like demotivating a little bit, to where it's like, I can't really train this week. There's not much I can do. I might kind of feel a little, I know clients feel a little down on their deloads just because they can't go to the gym and train. I don't know if your participants were like as crazy as some of my clients, like they live for training, but that's maybe one theory, but that is definitely hard to say why they might have experienced that.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And it did, there were some subjects in the study who don't love training as much and just wanted to do the study because their friends were doing it. But there's also individuals in the study that are freaks of nature like us, and they're masochistic and love being in the gym, right? So, and then you did see kind of a correlation there between their feelings of the deload. So people would come back and be like, I hated that. That was miserable. I hated not being able to work out. And then you had some that were like, that was awesome. I really liked not being yelled at you guys for a week. So it definitely depended on their perceptions of the deload, based their like return to the gym, and how they felt returning to the gym, I think was largely influenced by whether or not they enjoyed having a week off or not.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And was there anything else regarding the results that you wanted to cover on here before we kind of move forward here?
No, I think we touched on the performance aspects, the morphological changes, and the psychological aspects as well. So I think we're good to move on.
Perfect. Well, we are running a little low on time here, but if we could maybe just roll through some of the limitations of the study, and then we'll kind of end with that.
Yeah, so I'll just touch on the big ones, which is that we used young, healthy individuals, and we only looked at the lower body, right? So these findings can't necessarily be extrapolated to untrained individuals, older individuals, or even super well-trained individuals, or the upper body as well. Also only lasted 9 weeks, so we can't necessarily extrapolate these to like a training career. And then I think the biggest limitations obviously are that we used like a very specific time period and time frame. So we used like a really proactive deload paradigm versus like a reactive one. And then also that we used like a complete training cessation period as opposed to like a period of like lower volume and intensity. So I think those are kind of like the big take home limitations of the study that people on Instagram will happily tell you about.
Yeah, perfect. Well, I think we've covered the results. We've covered caveats of the study. This, this isn't deload or not deload. It's, just providing evidence, suggesting some different things here. So I think we covered everything well here. If people want to stay up to date on the research that you are doing and, anything else that you have coming up, where can they go to kind of follow you online and make sure they're up to date with that?
Yeah, so I'm on Instagram at Coleman et al. That's Coleman underscore et underscore all. And then for the real nerds out there, if you want to follow me on ResearchGate, it's just Max Coleman.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for coming on today, Max.
Yeah.
I enjoyed it.
Thank you so much for having me, man. I appreciate it.